exactly, I translate, therefore I am. Over 20 years later, this statement has only intensified in significance. I risk quoting myself not only to signal that this is a book about translation, but to acknowledge that I have been thinking about translation for my entire conscious life. As that early essay already makes clear, becoming a writer in English meant becoming a translator as well. And yet, I was a translator before I was a writer, not the other way around. As a graduate student, for my master's thesis, I translated some short stories by the great Bengali writer Ashapurna Devi, thanks in part to my mother's willingness to read them out loud. I would tape record her, play back the cassettes, and work off our homemade audiobook, given that Bengali is a language I speak and understand, but do not read with sophistication or ease. Before that formal project in college, I had studied Latin and ancient Greek. Once I'd learned enough grammar to be able to read texts, reading and translating melded into a single experience. That form of reading, dynamic and double, more active than passive, has remained the gold standard for me. But in fact, I was translating even before that, even before I knew how to read. I was raised speaking and living simultaneously in English and Bengali, and this meant translating between them constantly for myself and for others. The current volume gathers together my written thoughts about translation over the past 7 years. I have spent these years teaching creative writing and translation at Princeton University, but before I came to Princeton, I was living in Rome, where my linguistic landscape dramatically transformed, and Italian emerged like a new island in an archipelago, just as Ovid describes in the Metamorphoses, and what deep water had covered now emerges as mountains, dotting the sea with more Cyclades. In Italy, I began writing directly in Italian. I recounted this experience in Altre Parole, my first book in Italian, later translated into English as In Other Words. The first essay in the present volume, Why Italian, is a coda to that book, and also a point of departure, deepening and shedding further light on the basic question of why, after becoming a writer in English and writing 4 works of fiction in English, I chose to write in Italian instead. I did not translate In Other Words myself. At the time, I was putting all my energy into writing in Italian, and not translating anyone, never mind myself, into the language I know best. But this was all to change in 2015. I left Rome and began teaching at Princeton, where I felt immediately and instinctively drawn to the world of translation. It was in and among other languages at Princeton that I felt most at home. In Praise of Echo, written in 2019, while I was back in Rome on sabbatical, grew out of the first literary translation workshops I taught at Princeton. And just as I was embarking on the teaching of literary translation, I became a bona fide translator myself, taking on the task of turning a novel called Lacci by Domenico Starnone, whom I'd met in Rome, into English. Lacci, which became Ties, led to Scherzetto, Trick, and Confidenza, Trust. I have included my reflections on the experience of translating each of these novels, all of them by Starnone, in the present volume. I translated all 3 of them at Princeton. Another project I undertook at the university was the compiling and editing of the Penguin Book of Italian Short Stories, an anthology I was inspired to assemble, due partly to the fact that numerous Italian short story writers I discovered and wanted to share with my Princeton students in English had either not been translated to my satisfaction, or were only available in dated translations, or had not been translated at all. As I worked on that project, I realized that several of the authors in the book were not merely authors but also translators. I was struck by how many Italian writers of the previous century devoted considerable time and energy to practicing and promoting the art of translation, not only for personal mentorship and influence, but for furthering the essential aesthetic and political mission of opening linguistic and cultural borders, and of introducing readers to works they would not be able to access otherwise. As I contemplated the contributions of these author-translators, I was grateful that my creative life had taken a turn, and that I could now